everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Power of You, a virtual conversation with women around the world. Today, I have a fabulous guest. She is Princess Dr. Ambassador Inonge Lewanika. What a big title. She is a famous Zambian diplomat, and indeed, she is an African woman who has served all of Africa for much of her professional life. How are you today, my dear sister? What title do you prefer? Do you prefer princess, as I like to call you, or doctor or ambassador? Which one is your title that we should call you?
I think the easiest one is ambassador, because after you serve some years, it becomes a permanent title.
Exactly.
And in my culture, you don't call anybody who's older than you by their first name. So if you say, here in church, they call me grandma, all sorts of names, but generally ambassador is fine. And if you can't pronounce all my names, you can just say Ambassador Lewanika.
Yes, Ambassador Lewanika. Well, for me, because I don't know very many royalty, I just enjoy telling people that my dear friend is also royalty. So that's why I enjoy saying my princess. But indeed, the title of ambassador is quite appropriate as well. So we're delighted to have you. Finally, I get the chance to sit down and talk with you about your fabulous life. Thank you for making the time. So I just want you to take it away and tell us about yourself. Where did your life begin? From your earliest recollections, just narrate to us how you arrived at the position of a famous Zambian diplomat and someone who is an eminent person in the African Union.
Thank you so much, Sister Dawn. I'm delighted that finally we can sit down just and share sister to sister. My life, of course, dates back to God, who knew me before I was formed, who knew me in my mother's womb and my father's loins, and had a destiny for me. So that's where it starts. And then it goes, I think, to my grandparents. Let me start with my mother's mother. She seemed to be a lady who had strong convictions. And there are two examples, three. First of all, she allowed her children to go to school, both men and women. At that time, when girls in many parts of Africa did not go to school. Secondly, when she finished all the schools available in the kingdom, she did so well in school that she was nominated to go to a Methodist school about 1,000 miles from here. So her father made a lot of noise. He didn't want her to go and kept saying, "What kind of child are you? You have finished the whole school in the land. Even the boys are happy and content that they've finished the school in the land. And now you are going to a far-off country." And you can imagine in those days, 1,000 miles really is like you are going to the moon. So he kept making a lot of noise. And I think the missionaries heard about it. And my mother's village actually was the third missionary station. So their village was, the missionaries actually literally built their station in my mother's village. So they came to visit, ask about my mother's welfare and how going to school. And just before they left, my grandmother turns to her husband and say, "You have been making many objections. I want you to say it now or forever hold your peace." So in other words, actually, she was shaming him. And that was the end of the discussion. And then secondly, in those days, families used to take children from your sister, from your cousin, and take care of them. So my mother's twin sister was taken to a family of her mother, but they didn't treat her well. So when my mother's mother found out, she went and collected her daughter and said, "No child of mine will go anywhere again." So I can see that this lady really I think that's where my mother also gets it. Very, very strong woman, stands for her rights, was obsessed with education. But anyway, let me stop there on my mother's side. So here she was, the missionaries built their mission literally in her village. But one thing I want to say, because of what they did, and at that time, they were saying everything African is dark. So there was no singing, no dancing, no drums. So my mother and her siblings actually grew up like non-Africans. They don't know how to dance. They don't sing. They don't play the drums. They just have nothing of that African. So, so that is my mother's side. Now, my father, on the other hand, was just the opposite. What is significant is that my father's father, King Lewanika, was the first to receive the missionaries in this territory we call Zambia, because Zambia was just made in 1964. But in 1885, my grandfather received the missionaries because there was a lot of wars and civil wars. If you know the history of Southern Africa, there was Lobengula and there was a Chaka, and they were moving northwards, conquering territories. So my grandfather made a relationship with a king in Botswana, Kama, and a king in Lesotho, Mufweshwe. So really, I think what we call SADC today started with these three kings. So they shared everything, what they knew, they advised each other. So then the king of Lesotho and Botswana advised my grandfather that Chaka is serious. So you better make friendship with the British. The choice was because the missionaries were so nearby in Lesotho, were French. And then France had just had their revolution and got rid of their monarch. So these two monarchs, Botswana, which was called Bechuanaland at that time, and Lesotho, which was called Basotoland at that time, advised King Lewanika to make friendship with the British.
In order to better understand what Ambassador Lewanika is speaking about, it is good to have a brief history of the kingdom of Barotseland. Barotseland, which is the kingdom from which Ambassador Lewanika hails and is a princess, the daughter of a king and the granddaughter of a king, it was formerly a nation state which was a protectorate of northern Rhodesia during the British colonial period. It is the region between Namibia, Angola, Botswana, Zimbabwe, the eastern and northern provinces of Zambia, and the Katanga province of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Mainly, it is the western province of Zambia at this time. The capital city of the kingdom is Mongu, and the languages spoken are Lozi and English. You can see from this map that Barotseland is situated in the western province of Zambia, and it is bordered by Zimbabwe, Namibia, and the Lunda region, as well as the Katanga region of other states. King Lewanika I brought Barotseland under British control in 1890 through an agreement with Cecil Rhodes, the famous British explorer, entrepreneur, billionaire, who established the De Beers Diamond Company, and namely was dominant in the British South African Company, was the person with whom King Lewanika signed an agreement. But he felt deceived by the British South Africa Company in practice because what they seemed to say they would do was never done. Um, Things evolved in such a way as it became what we know today as apartheid. Two separate ways of handling people, the Africans staying in African villages and homelands, while the Europeans enjoyed the best of things. The son of Lewanika I, Mbikusita, ruled as King Lewanika II from 1968 to 1977. Ambassador Inonge is the daughter of King Lewanika II and the current king is called Lubosi Nwiko II. The title for king is also known as the Litunga.
Parts of Africa where they have experienced apartheid, Africans were not allowed to enter a shop through the door. No, I have moved very fast. So the missionaries was 1885.
Yes.
My father was born in 1905.
Okay, good.
And
okay.
Then my mother was born in 1921.
Okay. All right. Good. Excellent.
So now we are in the late 40s, early 50s.
Okay.
When I was growing up in a colonial setting where we lived in African townships, and I come from an area generally called, there are several towns that are called Copperbelt. One of them is Kitwe, where I grew up. So where the smoke and the fog comes from, the mines, it was facing African housing. In this setting where I lived in an African township, I went to an African school, African hospital, and then there was a European section where the storms and the fog from the mines were not in the European, where the city center was. And so this was a budget for Africans, but what they called European schools, European hospitals, they were supported by African resources, our government, which was run by the British. And then, of course, their schools had swimming pools, they had chemistry labs. The African part was called native education. We started by sitting on the floor and then on benches, just really apartheid.
Yes. So what did your father, the king, make of all of this? What did he think of all of this?
Okay, now that is when my father worked in this setting. First of all, Africans were daily labor workers. So my father initiated the trade unions in Zambia and registered them so that Africans could be paid every month. They could go on sick leave and they could go on leave. Before this, when you went on leave, you came back and started. They were paid daily, although they were doing a work every year. So my father changed that scenario so that Africans could also be paid per month, they could have a pension, they could go on leave. He didn't get to the point where my mother never got a pension because actually this gender bias started with colonialism, Europeans from England and other parts of Europe. So he and others joined what they call African welfare societies. So these welfare societies were campaigning and lobbying and negotiating for the justice to Africans in public affairs. And this is what led to my father becoming the first person to be the president of a political party. They successfully did that. They worked with others. There was a team actually. And they were one thing that is significant, they were very interested in the welfare of the people. They were always fighting for the people, not for themselves.
Yes, very interesting.
So my mother,
we see your blood had that leadership and that political already. Yes.
That's right, yes. So my mother also, after she finished the school in the land, went to this Methodist school where at the age of 16, she went by river and then by truck and then by train and walked 20 miles to school at age 16. And she went with 3 other girls who were all from the royal family. My mother came from a very poor family. So these princesses, carried servants, they had so much food. My mother just went. And she was not able to come for holidays. She stayed there the whole time. She was working during the times that others went. When she finished and came back, she was teaching at the highest school for girls in the kingdom. And by now, her father was the most proud father in the land. And my mother's salary was £1 sterling. And from that £1, she could literally buy clothes for the whole village and have to spare. So now where I come in is this. About 1930, my mother came back from school 1939. The missionaries organized my father to go to Israel, first as a politician, as a president of the African National Congress. He was invited as a government guest of Prime Minister Nehru Gandhi. And the other Africans also who were fighting the liberation, like Mr. Inonge from Kenya, Mr. Nehru really gave us a lot of sympathy and support for our liberation. So my father visited many parts of India, addressed the Indian parliament, and then came back. And then the missionaries arranged for my father to go to Israel. And when he came back, he was placed at the school, the mission school for girls, where my mother now was teaching. And he translated the Bible in our language about 1937-38. And that is how my mother and my father met. After my mother had finished her training as a teacher, my father had finished the translation of the Bible. And we suspect the missionaries, you sort of look around for their girls, make sure, they are married to who, that kind of thing. So I was actually, that's how I was born, in a town called Kitwe. But my mother was on a maternity leave in the western part of Zambia, in a village. So I was born in a village, but grew up in a city called Kitwe. When I finished the school there, primary school, I went to the same Methodist mission school that my mother went. At that time, it was really the pride of the nation. They're the only high national school for girls.
Excellent, excellent. And I see that some years later, indeed, you continued your education in the United States.
Yes, because when I finished my secondary school, actually my father took me just before the 2 years, so I went to a junior college, but we didn't have a university at that time in Zambia. So all my university education has been in the US, first in California, and then my PhD is from New York University.
Excellent. And so what was your dream at the time that you were studying? How did you imagine that your career, or what did you think that you would do?
Much earlier at this mission school, I wanted to be a medical doctor, but all the experiences closed the doors. If I saw somebody sick, I was miserable for a month. And the climax was that there was a fire in a nearby village to our school. And then they came to our health center, and the fire had burned them so bad. And I just couldn't even stand. My heart was broken. I couldn't look at those sores. That was the end of my desire to be a medical doctor. But I guess, I don't know, maybe it's the influence of my mother. Somehow I got very interested in the teaching career. But while we're in America, in our generation, there was that spirit of Pan-Africanism. Africa was really in our mind, our heart, our breath. We wanted to get education and go back to Africa. And then when I finished my training in California, a master's, I was awarded a California teacher's certificate. But my mind was so much on going home. I said, I will not take that certificate. I'm not going to work here. I'm not going to teach here. So throughout, in even my studies, my reading, I concentrated on what was relevant. So I grew up with a very strong passion of this continent. And actually, it comes from my grandfather. As I told you, he worked with the other kings. And my grandfather was one of the 4 kings who supported the South African National Congress. They were the patrons. My grandfather even donated money in 1912. So I really have a burning desire. I love Africa, the whole continent, and I would rather be in the continent, do something that I can do for the continent. So my desire for Africa, actually, I started long way from my grandfather.
Yes,
And then when we
exactly.
are
So
talking
you
about
were a
leadership,
part of you were a part of the young people that fomented the liberation movement that led to the liberation. Can you talk about the liberation of your country, of Zambia, and how, what was going on there and how that took place?
actually it took back in three places. My father's generation, the ones who started, were more for negotiations and lobbying and pushing. For example, some of the greatest achievements that they did was to remove the European from representing them in the legislative council and parliament and have Africans. So the older generation were more for negotiating and lobbying to change the system to put there. And then remember, our part of Africa was supposed to be a settler colony. My father had made friends during his political career with members of the House of Commons. So I think he's the only Zambian who has ever addressed both the House of Lords and the members of parliament together. He negotiated from Zambia not to be part of the settler colony, as Kenya was, as Zimbabwe was. So even my politics, I think, start from there. But after watching my father do so much, we had so many people in the house. We were always cooking. Some people were coming just in time when you are putting food on the table. And then because his generation were talking about negotiation, the generation that came after that were for the fight. They were for throwing stones. They were for killing Europeans. But the difference was that older people really worked as a team, and they were more like brothers and sisters. And their spouses also were working with women, training them, educating them to prepare for independence. For the young generation, it was a matter of give us now or you are dead. And eventually the older generation they were called like selves because they didn't want to throw stones or kill. But really what moved the whole liberation was the involvement of women. Eventually, when all the women got on the streets, the wind of change was irreversible.
Okay.
But what we lost was the interest for the welfare of the people and the teamwork, because with the young people came more like fighting for positions and for what they can get out of it.
So
it started as early as that.
You started your career as a teacher, but soon
Yes.
you ended up as a diplomat. You ended up as a government minister, official. You ran for president.
Yes.
There's so many things that you did. So talk to me about how you got out of education and into politics, or how you blended that.
Okay, my first job, I was actually teaching adults who had not finished secondary school, so they can catch up. But during that time, I was heavily involved in NGOs, non-governmental organizations. And of course, my mother was already one of the pioneers in that. So I was in the Girl Guides, in the YWCA, in the Red Cross, and that involvement close to the community really showed me what the majority of the people were going through. And coming from an environment where my parents were always fighting for justice and for the welfare of the people, trying to uplift their standards, that really gave me a forum. That's how I bounced in politics. It was basically, I didn't not go into politics willingly, because after I watched my father, I had made up my mind that I would rather do something else. But what happened, we had the first president lasted for 27 years. He abolished the multi-party state that he found, did a one-party state, and then the oil crisis of the 70s were making people more poor. We didn't have enough food. We had no medicine in the hospital. And that is really what triggered my going into politics. And actually, initially, I thought I was just helping the party, because from what I was reading, their constitution, their manifesto was talking about the welfare of the people. They were talking about basic services like health, like education, like water. So I kept moving around with them, explaining the manifesto to the people. But anyway, that's how one day I just woke up and I was at the deep end of politics. And for 1 year, I really struggled. And it was actually like a spiritual spiritual fight, because I really did not, after watching my father, I had made up my mind. But then I ended up in politics and I kept asking God, now, why am I here? Can I go now? But during that period, I read that book called Kingdom in Conflict about Wilberforce, why he was sent to a parliament and God gave him an assignment. Then I discovered my assignment was really to advocate and speak for those who are voiceless, the children, the women, the old people, which I had a wealth of knowledge from being an NGO, non-governmental organization. So I was really a fierce advocate.
And where were you advocating, in parliament or at the party level?
No, both. Parliament, we campaigned for 1 year, went all over. We wanted, of course, more women involved in politics and being in parliament. And then parliament just gave me a higher platform. And then, unfortunately, to our dismay, the party I joined, which won in 1991, there was not even one woman in cabinet. But wow. We kept talking to our presidential candidate and all the members of the executive committee. We would always include lobbying for women in all their speeches, and they never said no. That's why we were so shocked. We just woke up and no woman in cabinet. So what we did as organized women, so we listed all the women who were capable of being ambassadors, because we thought if we don't do this in black and white, we will wake up again and there's no ambassador there's no woman ambassador. So fortunately, I think there were a couple of women ambassadors. Yeah. Excellent. So my mother has always fought for women's rights throughout her career. She did not want to be the only successful one, but she was working with other women to pull other women also upwards.
So you served in the party, you served in parliament, and then eventually you were appointed as ambassador. Where was your first posting?
My first posting was in the United States. But after I finished my 10 years in parliament, I was appointed by the president to be his special envoy and ambassador for African affairs. Just at the time when we were changing from the Organization of African Unity, OAU, to the African Union. I was ambassador at Foreign Affairs and part of the team that was saying OAU has achieved its mandate, and the objective was to liberate Africa from colonialism, and every country had been liberalized politically, at least. Liberation is going on. So after that, we were saying, what kind of organization now do we need? Because the OAU had no mandate to interfere in other nations' affairs. It was just plain liberation. That is why in the African Union now we had an opportunity, those of us who worked on the transition, to make sure that women are there, to make sure that civil society is there, to make sure that we address our resources. That's why NEPAD, the development part of the economy in Africa, not for people to be taking our resources, but for us. So the resources of Africa were part of the African Union. Intervening in conflict was part of the African Union. As you know now, I think the African Union is the only intergovernmental organization that has a 50-50 presentation at the highest level of men and women. And also it's the only one that the civil society are part of the highest level of decision making. The only sad part, we didn't want it to stop at the African Union. We wanted this 50-50 to go to national governments, to local government, you know, to in the private sector. And this one, the fight is still going. It still goes on. In fact, the number of women in parliament all over Africa, there was a time when it was very high, but in many countries, including Zambia, the number of women in parliament is going down, because now it is not so much politics, and parliament is not so much for service, but it's for I, me, and myself, what I can get out of. So
Politics has
still
become
have
corrupt. It has become corrupt.
yes,
Is that what you're saying?
yes,
All over
and
Africa.
yes, and it is more like, what can I get out of it? Whether you are interested in people, and that's why some people, even MPs, they don't even go and visit their people. But initially, those of us who got into politics at that time, pushing for women, we were pushing for rural communities, we were pushing for community-based sort of projects and programs.
So just briefly list for us the different postings that you've had, just so we know step by step what your experiences are. And then I would want to just really delve into your expertise with regards to where is Africa now, and how can we get out from the corruption and from all of the evils that plague our continent. So first, just your particular experiences, okay, job-wise.
Okay, so what happened now? After we launched the African Union, after I had been ambassador for African affairs and foreign affairs for 1 year, the president told me, now your job is finished. I want to send you to Addis Ababa as ambassador. I was so excited about just being at the headquarters and heart of Africa. But somehow, I don't know what made him change his mind that I'm going to the United States. And I was not happy nor keen about that. I didn't, I was so obsessed with Africa. I just didn't see how my going to Washington is going to help Africa. But he had already made up his mind. So I went to the United States, and it turned out, I didn't know then, it turned out that it was a good for advocates. So after the whole continent was in my heart. So what I found in Washington, I was advocating many times, not only for Zambia, but for the whole continent. I remember when President Bush was going to Scotland for the G20, somebody called me in the evening and said the president is looking for somebody who is very positive about Africa. And I answered quickly that you are talking to that person. So even HIV, AIDS, on Congress, everything, I was advocating for the whole continent. So I served in Washington for 7.5 years. And during my tenure, I also covered Canada. I also covered Central America. I also covered South America, 19 countries altogether. It was later that the Republic of Zambia sent somebody else to Canada, who takes care of Cuba, and then somebody to South America. But I did present my credentials to President Lula, who I liked so much because I was so impressed with his commitment to the ordinary people.
Whose commitment you in
Brazil, the one who has
Brazil,
just been
the Brazilian
now.
President. Excellent.
Brazil,
yes.
yeah. That time, that was his first term, and now he has won. You know, the one who was fighting for the natural resources and so forth. So after 7.5 years in Washington, I was sent to Brussels, where I was representing Zambia to the European Union and also to the international courts in Netherlands. I was also ambassador to Luxembourg and also to the Netherlands. So I was there for 2 years. And it was after having gone to school in America and being an ambassador there, it was a nice change to be back in Europe with some of the traces back to the colonial systems that I grew up there. So after Brussels, I retired. Actually, I've been retiring almost every 10 years. Something happens that I think I'm retiring. I was at the University of Zambia for 8 years. I was with UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, for 10 years. I was in politics for 10 years. I was ambassador for 11 years. And now I am rural-based.
Extraordinary. So you had the personal experience of running for the highest office yourself.
Yes.
And
yes.
what was that like? What was that experience like for you?
Yeah, I ran for president. And after I finished my 10 years in parliament, I ran for president because when we started in our party, we were really talking about our commitment to the people. And even the rural areas, for example, will give us ideas. It was more like a discussion. But towards the end of 10 years, I noticed a change, even in the rural areas. I think they had been corrupted by some of the politicians. It was more like, what are you doing for us? Whereas in 1991, it was like, let's work together to improve our country. So within 10 years, actually, of being parliament, I saw that change. Where, for example, especially in the city centers, there would be members of every political party. They would get the uniform, the regalia of every, for what they can get out of it. And I saw that we are losing the sense of welfare. That is why I ran for president. And then people kept saying they want people of integrity. And of course, I had absolutely no resources. I mean, it was a crazy thing to do, but it was coming from deep down. Yes. For example, I only had one car, and two young men volunteered to drive me. So we went throughout the whole country. They were just changing day and night, talking to the people. You know, and I remember in some of the cities, I even went to bars asking them, why are you being bought? Why are you taking money instead of taking a stand? And they honestly and truly told me, these people are crooks. While they are campaigning, we will squeeze every penny out of them.
Fortunately, I've learned that as well, that to succeed in politics, you have to spend, it's so sad that you have to spend an extraordinary amount of money. I understand that there's a recent candidate, I think in Guatemala, who had very little resources and has just won. So maybe slowly the world will change. We don't know. But I'm going to shift the conversation because some of the women and men.
Just a minute. Don, I just want to say, you know, this change towards money is new. In 1991, I had just come from the UN. I didn't have money. We were discussing issues and the people understood.
So something happened in that 10-year period that led away from...
It's the kind of people who got into politics, because initially you felt service for the people, then you get into politics. Or like in my case, actually, the people put me in parliament. I didn't want. In fact, 2 constituencies were fighting for me. But what happened in 10 years? The economy went down. Zambia privatized everything. So the only money making was parliament. So the type of people that we eventually got in parliament had nothing to do with the people. By the way, most of women that I knew came from the NGO world, where they were exposed to communities and rural, and they were committed. But after 10 years, you have somebody who just wants to travel, they want a car, they want to build a house, and they are friends with a bank manager, and they get a loan. So it is really, it has not always been like that. Our parents in politics were not like that. But it's the politicians who have really turned that trend that now you have to have money to win.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that explanation, because it has really plagued my mind as to what happened to us in Africa, that we tend to attract people that are the worst. When we do have people of noble character like yourself, like many of the people I know in my country, that they don't stand a chance of being successful because of, like you said, the corruption that has now entered into the political landscape. So yeah, that's
I think the other thing I want to say, Don, we are using a system, a Western system that we don't fully understand. The only place I know where they understand parliament is Botswana. They are using their traditional governance plus the Western. So by the time they are discussing something in parliament, they have already discussed it traditionally. So we are using a system we don't understand, number one. Number two, the people don't know anything about parliament. They don't know why parliament is there. So the major problem is we are using a system that we don't understand, and many times it's controlled by other people for the resources they can get out of Africa. In fact, most of our issues are international, because even this corruption, if you look at many of the so-called developed countries, I mean, you look at the old prime minister like Churchill, Macmillan, Douglas, and you look today, it's just the same. It's sort of the same wind of change, which is very selfish and greedy, even tricking other nations, tricking their own people, not telling the truth. It's sort of widespread. But I am sad for Africa, because we do have a traditional value system. Even our governance system, if you check it, there are many things there for the people. Somebody was telling me in Nigeria, before independence or soon, there was a time when if you are selling vegetables, you leave them on the street with a price and go home. And when you come back, you will find the money. So something has happened. I don't always want to blame the West. There is a wind of change for the better, but we have also mixed up with other systems that we don't understand. After being independent for 60 years, we should be like Botswana. Take some of the values of how you govern and talk to people traditionally and marry them with parliament.
Exactly. I think that's a brilliant piece of advice. We have to customize our governance to the way that our cultures are, and not just adopt something that doesn't work for us. That's a brilliant point. Yeah. So, it's so interesting. We could talk politics the entire time, but I'm just going to shift a little bit. How have you balanced your domestic life and your professional life of service? You have given so much of your life to serve not only your own country and your own people, but the entire continent of Africa. In fact, the world. But you are a minister of the gospel. You are a mother, a grandmother. So tell us how, in terms of your social and domestic life, how have you married that with your professional and political life? How have you been able to do that?
I think, let me give the credit to my mother, because my mother was a professional woman. She was a pioneer of women in education. She was also a pioneer of women in non-governmental organizations. She was one of the founders of the Girl Guides, of the YWCA, also was into politics. And somehow, and my father was also very busy, but I really had a wonderful childhood of quality time. My parents were busy. They were community leaders. But I can remember that times when we were together quite often, we really had a wonderful time. For example, my father used to organize debates just within our siblings. Our different schools would debate. We used to read the Bible together. My father used to tell us about our history. I mean, it was just wonderful coming. And then they used to take us to the village. And in our days when we went to a village, life in the village was better than in the city. The love that we received from our parents, siblings, the excellent food, that balancing act actually I learned from my father was so busy. And then in the communities, the children followed him everywhere, but really they loved us. I grew up on my daddy's lap, and I give him credit. So it was natural for me to be a professional woman, and also to have children, and be also a preacher. Unfortunately, my marriage was very not successful. It didn't last long, unfortunately. But I saw my mother balance all that. But for me, the glue in all this is God. If it was not for the Lord, I don't think at 80 years, right now, I am on the committee where we are celebrating a hospital that is named after my grandfather, King Lewanika Hospital, that his first son built. And of course, now I have a chance to write books. So I am also trying to put some of the experiences. For example, my latest book is Women in Politics. It started actually with our parents. Who were they? We don't even remember them. So at the beginning, I just mentioned a few women my mother's age, a few women in Kenya, who started women in politics. And then, of course, I was in Abidjan working for UNICEF when the war in Liberia broke. And life was normal. In fact, a tailor was making an outfit for me in Liberia. I'm sitting in Abidjan. And when that war broke, I had 10 refugees in my house from Liberia. And that opened my eyes that what happened in Liberia can happen in any country. Because I was going to Liberia 3 or 4 times. Everything seemed normal. Then we woke up one day. Although you could, now that we have seen some of the experiences, you look back and say, I think this was coming. We didn't catch it. So I ended up with 10 women, 10 families in my house. And that's when I actually got involved also in the African Women Peace Movement, because I wanted every nation to be prepared and stop in some places we can. And most of it is coming from politics of selfishness, of greed, of dividing people. And in fact, I was one of the 5 women who addressed the United Nations Security Council that women must be involved in all peace processes. If you watch all this havoc going on around the world, it's all men. When they come to discuss a resolution of conflict, it's all men. And you know what is interesting? In 2000, African Women in Peace got together in Zanzibar and called for no guns in Africa. We said, put them down. But you see, the OAU has just discovered that, because even there, where you have women 50-50, they didn't involve women in the peace process. We told them 20 years ago that get rid of the guns. But now they waited 20 years. Now we have guns all over, coming from all over the world.
Those are the actual weapons of mass destruction. The small weapons, they are the mass destruction.
Yes.
So just to sort of, it's almost impossible to just encapsulate you in a nutshell, but I think we can do it, because the themes that you are describing have run throughout your life in every single thing you're doing. But I'm hearing the concern about women, empowering women is a big theme with you. I hear the theme of Africa and the need for the continent to stand united and, sort of find our own solutions instead of copying the solutions, let's say, of European colonizers. Is there anything else? Can you just tell me the top 3 issues that you think we should focus on as women and as Africans? What are our top priorities in a nutshell? Because I think that kind of defines who Ambassador Lewanika is.
I think we need to listen to people. We need to listen to the people, especially rural people, who tell you advice and who live such a life that are examples without expecting you to pay them. We really need to listen to the people. The people of Africa, average people in the deep rural areas, have got it right. They've survived all these years. World Bank money never reaches them. Nothing that the government hardly reaches them. But they are still raising families. They are growing their own food. Number 1 is listen to the people. Number 2 is the children.
The children.
These monsters with guns were brought by somebody. And somebody somehow dropped the ball. So we need to take it personally, the kind of children you are raising, the grandchildren, the few minutes that you have them. My 2 grandchildren were just here in the village. They had such a wonderful time. They are coming back, and their siblings, they are coming back. They are just intrigued by the people I'm telling you, listen. So let's pay attention, give them time, the young people. Everybody don't let the government can't grow your children. First time, you cannot grow children on the phone. And the challenge we have is the social media now. So I am very optimistic because of my love for Africa. We can do it, but it has to start family by family, home by home, next door community.
Ambassador Lewanika, so much wisdom, such a brilliant life, such rich experiences. This has been so fascinating just to listen to you and to hear you expound on the things that you feel passionate about. Thank you, thank you, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Any final words? Who we hope will hear this is a lot of the young people that we think that you care about. So the African people, the people worldwide, any final words to add, although we've had such a rich lesson already?
It has been, I think, let's do things together.
Let's
This
do
one
things
by
together.
one thing, you don't go far.
You don't go far.
We need teamwork in working with our children, teamwork with our young people, teamwork in agriculture, learn from each other, that kind of thing. Let's stay together.
The
And
world is a
Africa
village.
Yes,
Africa is a village, and the whole world is really a village if you talk about bringing goodness and justice to the world. God bless you. God bless you. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Glory to God. Thank you so much. It has been my pleasure to fellowship with you across the miles, but right here in my sitting room.
This has been another edition of The Power of You, a virtual conversation with women around the world. We have Ambassador Inonge Lewanika with us and their brilliant ideas that she has shared, her passion for life, her royal upbringing, her life as a politician, and it's ongoing. Thank you, thank you, thank you.